Melee Reflection, a new type of spell to Warhammer 3, but how does it work? Where should we use it? What the hell is it? Tell us. Okay, I will, as you asked so nicely. So there are only 2 instances of this coming into play. The first one is in this Nurgle spell, Curse of the Leper. You can see melee damage reflection plus 14, plus 30 armor on this spell as well. This costs 7 magic, but there is an overcast version as well, which doubles the armor to 60 and doubles the melee reflection damage to 28. The other instance of melee damage reflection is on the Fire Belly for the Ogres. He has an ability called Flame Incarnate, can be used twice, melee damage reflection plus 14, so whenever something hits him, he'll reflect 14 damage back at them when this ability is active. So what that number literally means, 14 or 28, is when a unit, a friendly unit with this ability active on it, is hit, it will reflect X amount of damage back at the attacker. Now that might not sound like a lot of damage, only 14, but if you consider an infantry situation where there's a lot of attacks happening at once against a friendly unit, those 14s are going to add up, or 28s if it's overcast, so there is some serious damage to be done here. To test, let's try some Forsaken of Nurgle against some Forsaken of Nurgle. One with the Curse of the Leper, one without. So a straight up fair fight unit wise, let's see how much of a difference this spell can make. I am going to overcast it, so it's going to add 60 armor and 28 melee damage reflection, so this is the most you should be able to get out of it. And you can see my buffed up Forsaken are absolutely ruining the enemy Forsaken because they're taking so much damage back. But it's not only the melee reflection coming into effect on this spell, the extra 60 armor is really helping my Forsaken out because Forsaken don't have armor piercing damage, or very little of it, so it's mostly base damage that can be blocked by armor, and when a unit has 100 and something armor, they survive way better against predominantly base damage units. So we can see there's some good return when used against infantry. What about if it's against a single entity like a Lord? Well, you can have some great return here too, when cast on infantry anyway. Now watch the Herald's health here, boom! A big chunk goes missing as he swings his weapon and hits a bunch of Nurglings, all reflecting 28 damage back at him. That did nearly 200 damage to him. This is because of good old splash attacks. If you've seen my video on splash attacks, you'll understand that units have a splash attack max. Let's say the Herald's is 4 and he hit these 4 bunches of Nurglings. They will potentially return up to 28 damage to him. Not always 28, might be less sometimes. I imagine that 28 damage is split between base damage and armor piercing damage with the same ratio of whatever the unit has. If it does 70% base damage and 30 armor piercing, that's what that 28 damage will probably be. That's an assumption and not 100% fact, but it doesn't really matter because it's such a small amount of damage. It's just damage. Doesn't really matter the ratios of it. But those 28 add up, of course, to 112 in this case, so that's the maximum amount of damage he could do to himself on the swing. I imagine the Herald of Khorne, though, probably has a 6 or 7 splash damage max. So there's probably nearer 200 damage, as we saw him do to himself just now. So the long story short here, if that was a bit confusing, just know that if you use Curse of the Leper on an infantry unit when it's fighting a single entity, that's good. The more you can surround that entity and make sure it hits its splash attack max, the more damage you'll be able to do to it, or it'll do to itself when it hits you. There is a place that melee damage reflection is kind of useless though, and that is in 1v1 fights between characters or any single entity. There's not enough attacks going on here to make the damage return worthwhile. In the 18 seconds that Curse of the Leper lasts, you might see 3 or 4 attacks from an enemy, but there's a good chance that they won't all land and thus won't return damage, so you're probably only going to get about maybe 50 damage back, and that's if you use the overcast version of the spell. 10 winds of magic for 50 damage on a Lord is really not worth it. And the same goes for the Fire Belly. You want to use his Flame Incarnate ability to return melee damage when he's surrounded by things, not in 1v1s. Maybe even things like monstrous infantry don't really have enough attacks coming to make it worthwhile. Mostly infantry with the high numbers. You can see all the attacks coming in behind the Fire Belly here. These would all be reflecting damage if this Fire Belly was using Flame Incarnate, and that would be adding up to take health off all the models, because a typical infantry model's health of a human type unit probably has somewhere between like 60 and 80 health, so that'll add up with those melee reflections. Cavalry could maybe be okay for this if you've got like 40 models and they're surrounding the entity. That could be some good damage that you could reflect on cavalry as well, but mostly infantry with the high numbers of attacks is where this kind of ability, melee damage reflection, is going to shine. So whether you use Curse of the Leper or Flame Incarnate, Don't use it in situations where your attacked unit isn't really getting attacked that much. The more attacks coming towards your unit, the better. Unless it's a single entity that technically only does one attack, but it hits multiple models, and thus the return adds up. Hopefully that all makes some sense. If not, you can watch this video about splash attacks to understand it better. Hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the future.